All right, so this is the motivation and emotion chapter for Introduction to Psychology. So when we talk about motivation, we're talking about factors that activate, direct, and sustain goal-directed behavior. We can't measure these directly, so we have to kind of infer them from behavior. So we can infer them from activation. So when do you initiate the behavior? So academic motivation might be inferred by enrolling from in classes. Persistence is how much continued effort you have. So do you continue to come to class every day throughout the whole semester? Intensity is kind of the vigor of responding. So how much or how hard do you study for your classes? And all those put together make up your academic achievement. The motives are the whys of behavior, and so we need motives to explain why someone's engaging in a certain behavior. So there are a couple of different theories of motivation. Instinct theories really argue that we have kind of inborn motivators that are programmed by nature. We have these kind of instincts. And so these instincts are fixed patterns that we respond to everything in the same way. These have kind of fallen out of behavior because they only describe, they don't really explain why we see this. And it doesn't account for the fact that human behavior is really complex, right? Is there a baseball playing instinct or an academic instinct? It just doesn't make sense in the complex behaviors that we see. So another theory is drive theory. And drive theory, the idea here is that behavior is motivated by drives that arrive from biological needs demanding satisfaction. So we have needs, which are a state of deprivation. And a drive is basically the bodily tension from an unmet need. So ideally, we want a constant level of these things, and we have this goal of drive reduction to get to homeostasis, or this level need. We can have primary and secondary drives. So primary drives are biological, hunger and thirst, things like that. Secondary drives come from experience. So we know that with money, we can purchase the other things that we want. And this is really useful to explain behavior that have kind of biological components like hunger. But we also know that hunger is more than just physiological because we eat when we're not hungry. Incentive theory is another one to try to address this. So incentives are rewards or stimuli that motivate action and believe it will satisfy a need or a desire. So this is different from drive theory in that this is about the pull of these incentives that we want rather than a push from something internal. So we have to think about incentive value, how much of a reward is desired, and how much we desire a certain reward is really determined in part by cultural influences. So would you be more motivated to do something at work by a bonus, extra money, or by time off? We're going to have individual differences in these motives. Arousal theory is the idea that basically we find very high and very low levels of arousal unappealing. And so we have these stimulus motives that are we have this desire for cognitive stimulation and exploration. When we have too much of it, we don't like it. And when we have too little, we don't like it. And so we all have kind of this optimal level of arousal that we seek to access. And so when people are sensation seekers, they have a high level of optimal arousal, so they engage in what we consider kind of risky behavior. So, for example, someone who engages in a really risky sport like base jumping, we would consider them sensation seeking. Finally, humanistic theory argues that people are motivated to realize their personal potential. So this emphasizes kind of the psychological or cognitive motivations rather than biological motivations. And it really gives people kind of their own volition in kind of deciding what they want to do. Okay, so we're going to talk about eating behavior as a basic biological motivation. So hunger is that basic biological motive, but eating is a really complex interaction of both biological but also social and psychological factors too. So if you've ever eaten when you're depressed, or eaten because you're out with friends who are eating, or judge people based on what they're eating, all of these really underscore the fact that eating is more than just biology. So the basic principle of kind of how much we need to eat is called energy homeostasis. So the idea here is that food that you consume is broken down into energy that your body needs to function. So this is the energy intake on the left side. About a third of your energy is used for daily physical activity. This is the daily physical activity. This is on the right side, is that physical engagement, but 2/3 of your energy is used to sustain basic life function. So the BMR is the basal metabolic rate. This is just the energy that your body burns existing. So your heart beating, your lungs, your things like that. So if we are in a state of energy homeostasis, which most people experience most of the time, we consume as many calories as we expend. So all of the calories that we are eating on a daily basis go to this basal metabolic rate or to the physical activity or exercise. So if we consume a certain number of calories per day, that's how many our body is using up. But sometimes we eat more calories than we are using, which would cause weight gain. Or if we use more calories than we're eating, that would cause weight loss. And so these are what cause fluctuations in weight. There are also kind of signals that regulate eating. So there are short-term signals. So there are biological changes like blood glucose and insulin levels. A hormone called ghrelin measures the stretch in your stomach, body temperature. All of these things are physiological symptoms that tell us it's time to stop eating. But there's also psychological symptoms like conditioning, right? So the time of day can actually lead people to feel hungry. So if you eat every day after your 12 o'clock class, you get out of your 12 o'clock class, it doesn't matter if you ate right before you went in, you feel hungry. We also have operant conditioning that can affect us. So things like foods are positive rewards, and so sometimes we eat because it's positive even if we're not hungry. Satiation signals are feelings of fullness that tell someone to stop eating. There are psychological components of this. For example, there's the decline in positive incentive from food. So the first piece of pizza you eat is really, really good. The second one's pretty good. If you get to a fourth or fifth piece, you're probably not really enjoying it as much. But we also have this phenomenon of sensory specific satiety. This is basically that experience of you might be full of pizza, but when somebody brings out the cake, all of a sudden you're hungry again. So there's lots of different things that go into regulating our eating. There are also long-term things that influence our eating. So there are chemical messengers that help us maintain a stable body weight. So leptin and insulin, the amount of these hormones correlates with body fat. The neuropeptide Y can affect us when we have a negative energy balance. And so the kind of combination of short and long-term biological signals influences our overall energy balance. And there's a couple of theories of why, of kind of how weight changes over time. So there's the set point theory, which argues that basically everyone has a natural or optimal weight that our body tries to maintain. If this were true, then we should all generally have the same weight across our lifespan. But the truth is many people drift upwards in terms of their weight. So this has led to the settling point theory, which is basically that your body kind of ultimately settles on an equilibrium between how much energy you consume and how much energy you use. So if you have a negative or positive energy balance, your settling point could change. So one thing we often see is kind of the rates of obesity are growing. Often the way we measure this is through body mass index, which is a measure of the height in relation to the weight. And we know that there's a number of factors that can actually influence weight. Some of them are physiological, some of them are psychological. So sleep. So having not enough sleep can influence leptin and ghrelin, which can affect your hormones in terms of making you feel hungry. We also have a lot of really highly positive or highly palatable food. So this leads food to have really positive incentives, which makes us want to eat. So generally, because we have a lot of food and it's plentiful, we often overeat. We consume more calories than we need. There's also this phenomenon of the cafeteria diet effect, which is basically the more variety there is, the more we consume. So this is true in general, but especially if you're at a buffet or at a cafeteria, you have a lot of choices, so we tend to consume more. Also, we generally live a sedentary lifestyle, right? We evolved to be hunters and gatherers who are moving around a lot. We don't need to do that anymore, and so we don't have exercise just built into our daily life. Okay, so we define obesity as a BMI of above 30, and there's a number of factors that we know contribute to it. So genetics, so people who have a family history of obesity are 2 to 3 times more likely, but genes lead to a susceptibility. They don't necessarily cause obesity. Leptin resistance. So the argument here is that normally leptin regulates our body weight, but in people who are overweight, it doesn't seem to work the same way, and it's not being transported to the brain in the same way. So this might contribute to problems with obesity. BMR resistance to maintaining weight. This is remember the BMR is the basal metabolic rate. And the argument is here, basically, when you diet, you reduce how many calories you consume. What happens is your fat cells shrink and your body actually slows down its metabolism, so you actually need fewer calories to live as you're losing weight. What happens then is if you go off your diet and you start eating normally again, your body stores all these new calories and you put on even more weight than you had before. So this is called weight cycling or yo-yo dieting, and this really happens because that basal metabolic rate, how much energy or calories your body needs to function, actually changes depending on how much you're eating. Okay, now we're going to move on to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is more of a humanistic theory. And so Abraham Maslow looked at these psychological needs as motivators, although he included the physiological needs. So he basically argued that both biological and psychological needs play a role. And so he said there are 5 levels of needs, and you have to satisfy the needs at the lowest level before you can get higher up. So the lowest level is that physiological water, breathing, food, water, sleep. These are the basic biological motives. If you're not getting sleep, you're not going to be worried about your creativity or your love life. You need to meet those basic needs first. Next is safety and security of your physical body, employment, resources, your family, things like that. Next, love and belonging, so family, friendship, intimacy, things like that. As you get higher, if you have all of those basic level things, then you can worry about self-esteem and confidence, whether people respect you. And at the ultimate level, you have self-actualization. And so the argument with self-actualization is you have fulfilled your unique potential, your everything you're capable of being. But you cannot worry about that. You can't think about that if those lower level needs are not being met. There's a number of issues with kind of confirming Maslow's theory, but this basic idea does have some support. Relatedly, self-determination theory looks just at the psychological or psychosocial needs, and they argue that basically there's 3 of them. We have a need for autonomy, so you want to feel like you determine or control your own set of your own behavior and goals. There's a need for relatedness, so we want to feel like we can connect and interact with other people. And there's a need for competence or achievement. We want to feel like we're good at things and we're effective. And when we have those 3 things, it makes us happy. Okay, next we're going to move on to emotions. And we define emotions as complex feeling states. Emotions cause physiological changes like bodily arousal, sympathetic nervous system arousal, but they also include cognitive processes. So how do we subjectively evaluate what's going on? How do we interpret it? And then also behavioral expression. So what do we actually do? Do we approach someone? Do we avoid them? Our emotions are going to influence that. And emotions play a role in a lot of things. They can motivate action. They can kind of trigger motivated behavior. They can lead us to set goals or can be a goal themselves. But they're really key to successful relationships. And we can come up with several evolutionary explanations for why it's important that we even have emotions, right? So we can think about fear leading us to flee from an attacker, anger leading us to fight a rival, love leading us to seek out a mate and care for our children, disgust leading us to avoid something that made us sick. So there are certainly reasons why we have developed emotions. And the subjective experience of emotion is really complicated because it's not just one emotion at a time. We might experience multiple different emotions. And there are also disorders associated with emotion. So for example, mood disorders, we think of as people being kind of over emotional. So bipolar disorder or depression, these are people who are experiencing, or these disorders happen when people experience kind of emotions so strongly disrupt daily functioning. In contrast, alexithymia is people who are under emotional, and so they don't experience subjective components of the emotions. Okay, so there's substantial evidence that we have, there are universal facial expressions, and that we see even in cultures that don't have access to kind of Western media. So the first one there is surprise, the second is disgust, the third is happiness, the fourth is sadness, down onto the second row, that is fear and anger, and the last two are contempt, which is relatively a recent addition. But all of these emotions we can recognize and understand universally across cultures. There are also significant physiological components to emotions. So we have kind of the facial expression of our emotions, but also our sympathetic nervous system. So if we go back to chapter 2, remember that the sympathetic nervous system comes into play when that fight-flight system kicks on. So it includes things like changes in heart rate, changes in skin temperature, tears, sweating, shaking. So it's not just that mental feeling, there are physiological components that go with emotions as well. And just one demonstration, I encourage you to kind of pause this and look more closely. These are heat maps of people's bodies, and you can see the temperature change really differs depending on what emotion people are feeling. And so there are these common physiological changes that we see with different emotions. Okay, so one thing that influences these is the brain, right? So the amygdala is in charge of processing the fight or flight response. And it's really key for the emotional response, specifically to fear. And there's actually two pathways to processing fear, and a part of the brain called the thalamus really determines how it's going to be processed. In the direct pathway, the thalamus says this is an immediate threat, you need to either fight or flee right away, and it sends that message right up to the amygdala so you don't think about it. It's not a conscious decision. In contrast, the indirect pathway happens if it's not as clear that this is an immediate threat. And so the thalamus sends a signal to the cortex, which is the main part of the brain, which enables you to think a little more consciously about it, and then sends it to the amygdala to determine whether you need to fight or flee. So emotional expression generally develops early. So at birth, we have these universal emotions like joy, interest, disgust, and pain. By 2 months, we see anger and sadness. By 6 months, we see fear. So those universal expressions, not only are they true across culture, but they develop very early on. And it's important to remember that these facial expressions tend to express internal feelings. But there's also some interesting evidence that the expression on your face can actually influence the internal feelings as well. So the facial feedback hypothesis has shown that our facial muscles actually send a message to the brain about the emotions being expressed. So for example, people were asked to hold a pencil in their mouth in a way that made them essentially smile without using the word smile, or a way that made them frown. And what they found was the people who were smiling without being told to smile actually reported feeling happier than the people who were frowning. So the muscles on their faces actually sent a signal to make them happy. So this has some interesting kind of interventions for things like depression, where maybe if we have people fake positive emotions, it could potentially lead to real positive emotions. Okay. Finally, though, although we have these universal facial expressions or facial emotions, the display rules differ across cultures. So display rules are social and cultural rules that regulate when, how, and where a person might express emotions. There are certain times in our culture where it might be okay to express fear, but there are also times when you might feel fear but need to hide it. Same goes with anger, sadness, happiness. So for example, if you and your friend are applying to the same grad school and your friend doesn't get in, but you get in, you might feel very happy, but you don't want to express that happiness in front of your friend. So we see a lot of kind of cultural differences in when and how people will express emotions, even if we're all familiar with the same core emotions. So that is where we're going to end for today.